The rain over London was relentless that night, cold, quiet, and watchful. Inside a dimly lit safe house off Vauxhall Bridge, two men sat across from each other. One British, one Israeli, their briefcases locked, their words measured. A half-finished pot of tea steamed between them as they traded names that never appeared on paper. One represented MI6, the United Kingdom's legendary secret intelligence service. The other, Mossad, Israel's powerful and shadowy espionage agency. This wasn't their first meeting, but tonight, something was different. The air felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. "Our target is moving through Europe again," the Mossad man said quietly. "If we don't act fast, Tehran will get what it needs." The MI6 officer didn't answer right away. He just watched the steam fade from his cup. Then, he replied, "We'll share the files. But this time, no unilateral action. Understood?" A faint smile crossed the Mossad agent's face. "Of course," he said. But they both knew what that meant. In espionage, trust is tactical, not emotional. Before we go deeper into this operation, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? And if you love stories that uncover the real hidden wars of our world, the ones the public never gets to see, make sure you're subscribed to Spy Wars, Declassified. Let's begin. By the early 2000s, the alliance between MI6 and Mossad had grown into one of the most intricate covert relationships in the world. Both had common enemies: Iran's expanding intelligence presence in Europe, Hezbollah's secret financial pipelines, and a rising tide of cyber espionage. At the surface, the partnership was flawless. Behind closed doors, it was built on quiet resentment and mutual suspicion. After the September 11th attacks, Western intelligence agencies closed ranks. MI6, Mossad, and the CIA shared unprecedented access to satellite data, encrypted signals, and financial intelligence. Mossad provided leads on militant networks in North Africa and Europe, while MI6 offered access to the diplomatic and economic webs Mossad couldn't reach. Together, they disrupted funding channels, uncovered secret weapons routes, and even exchanged agents under deep cover. London became a silent hub, not just for British spies, but for Mossad's European liaisons operating under diplomatic fronts. But the British way of intelligence was old world, deliberate, quiet, rooted in plausible deniability. Mossad, on the other hand, had a reputation for speed, aggression, and plausible risk. As one retired British officer later described it, "We were surgeons, they were commandos." That difference in philosophy was destined to clash. The first fracture appeared in 2004. MI6 was running an operation in Berlin targeting a shadowy intermediary suspected of laundering money for Tehran's missile research program. Mossad was quietly watching the same target, but didn't tell the British. Without warning, the man vanished. Weeks later, his body turned up in the outskirts of Hamburg. The autopsy was inconclusive, but every intelligence service in Europe knew what had happened. MI6's Berlin station was blindsided. Not only had their operation collapsed, but a key informant who'd risked his life to gather intelligence on Iran's procurement networks disappeared too, presumed dead or exfiltrated. Officially, London said nothing. Unofficially, that night marked the beginning of distrust. Mossad, however, justified the move internally. When it comes to Iran, hesitation is a luxury. From that point on, MI6's Iran desk began restricting shared data. Certain intelligence files were marked UK eyes only. Joint operations slowed down, but both agencies still needed each other, and that made the coming years more dangerous. In 2007, a covert mission known internally as Silver Dagger was launched. MI6 and Mossad were to jointly monitor arms trafficking routes through Eastern Europe. The target, a network of front companies supplying dual-use technology to Iran. The mission was delicate. It required cooperation between London, Tel Aviv, and several European capitals. Initially, coordination was smooth, but Mossad's field team in Vienna began moving faster than the agreed plan. Surveillance footage later revealed a tail operation that MI6 hadn't sanctioned. Agents following a Czech intermediary tied to the deal. The British protested. Vienna's neutrality laws made any unauthorized action a diplomatic time bomb. Mossad didn't care. 2 weeks later, the Czech businessman fled to Cyprus and was never seen again. When MI6 demanded an explanation, Mossad's response was curt. The threat was neutralized. The British side called it reckless. The Israeli side called it necessary. By 2008, the partnership had become a chess game. Both sides continued to exchange intelligence, but the trust had thinned to a whisper. In one notable briefing at Vauxhall Cross, a senior MI6 director told his staff, "Cooperation with Tel Aviv is no longer about friendship, it's about containment." In Tel Aviv, a former Mossad case officer echoed the same sentiment privately. "We respect MI6, but they still think the Cold War never ended. We're fighting enemies who don't play by their rules." The difference wasn't personal, it was philosophical. MI6 relied on diplomacy, alliances, and quiet influence. Mossad relied on preemption, hit first, question later. And as 2009 approached, that philosophical divide would explode into one of the biggest intelligence scandals in modern history. An operation that would nearly destroy what was left of their alliance. Late in 2009, MI6 analysts picked up chatter about an Iranian-linked arms broker moving between Europe and the Middle East, a man believed to be securing advanced guidance systems for Tehran's ballistic missile program. The target was elusive, protected by diplomatic cover and private security firms. Both agencies wanted him, but for different reasons. For MI6, he was an intelligence source. For Mossad, he was a threat that needed to disappear. The British insisted on surveillance and data extraction. Mossad argued for immediate neutralization. A secret coordination cell was formed in Brussels to manage the operation. But even in those rooms, filled with analysts, encrypted phones, and shared coffee cups, no one truly trusted the other. The British were convinced Mossad would act on its own. Mossad was convinced MI6 would leak the target's location to European partners, slowing down the mission. Both were right, because as history would soon reveal, one side moved before the other even realized what was happening. And that right there is where everything began to unravel. The snow in Vienna had begun to melt, revealing streets slick with rain and silence. Inside a modest apartment rented under a false Cypriot passport, a Mossad surveillance team sat in the glow of laptop screens and encrypted radios. Their target, Hassan R., an Iranian arms broker with ties to Tehran's ballistic research unit, was scheduled to meet a European defense contractor within the next 24 hours. The mission's code name was Winter Harvest. Officially, it was a joint surveillance operation between Mossad and MI6, coordinated under a shared European liaison cell. Unofficially, Mossad had already decided that if the opportunity arose, they would act alone. For weeks, MI6 had insisted on patience. They wanted to monitor, intercept communications, build a prosecutable chain of evidence, not turn Vienna into another international scandal. But Mossad didn't see this as a courtroom case. They saw it as a security threat. To them, Hassan R. wasn't a businessman, he was a conduit, helping Iran move technology across Europe's back channels. In London, at Vauxhall Cross, the MI6 operations floor hummed with quiet tension. A live feed from Vienna was displayed on one of the secure monitors. A British analyst leaned toward her superior. Tel Aviv's team hasn't checked in for 6 hours. They're probably running a tale, the officer said, though he didn't sound convinced. By dawn, both would realize how wrong they were. At 05:42 local time, as Hassan R. left his hotel suite, 2 men approached him from opposite directions. Surveillance footage later revealed a struggle near his car. Within minutes, his security guard was down, and the Iranian national was missing. By noon, the story hit Austrian media. Businessman with ties to Middle East defense firms missing in Vienna. MI6's liaison officer in the Israeli embassy demanded answers. None came. In Tel Aviv, Mossad's internal files marked the operation as successful termination. In London, it was labeled unauthorized interference. That single event, Winter Harvest, ruptured decades of intelligence cooperation. MI6 had not only lost a potential double agent, but an informant who'd been quietly feeding data about Iran's procurement efforts to British handlers. The sudden disappearance triggered diplomatic chaos. Within hours, European intelligence services, already uneasy after Mossad's earlier forged passport scandals, began combing through their immigration records. Several fake identities used by the Vienna team were traced back to European citizens, including, once again, British names. That detail ignited fury inside the Foreign Office. "We cannot have Israeli agents running operations in Europe under our passports," one senior official said in an emergency meeting. "It compromises everything we stand for, and every agent we have in the field." At Vauxhall Cross, the reaction was immediate and severe. MI6 froze all ongoing coordination with Mossad's European desk. Several shared intelligence databases were cut off overnight. Meanwhile, a quiet diplomatic storm brewed behind the scenes. The British ambassador in Tel Aviv was instructed to seek urgent clarifications from the Israeli government. Phrasing that in diplomatic language meant "we know what you did." But Mossad had expected this. Inside their headquarters in Glilo, north of Tel Aviv, the operations architects defended their actions. They argued that MI6's slow bureaucracy risked letting the target slip through their fingers. Again, to them, the Vienna incident wasn't a betrayal, it was necessity. One operative reportedly said, "You don't stop an arms dealer with paperwork." Still, the fallout was brutal. The British Home Office quietly investigated how Mossad had managed to clone British passports yet again, years after the Dubai assassination controversy. It wasn't the first time Israel's intelligence service had used European identities to operate covertly. But this time, it was against the express will of one of their closest allies. Within weeks, whispers began circulating in Brussels and Berlin that the UK was reconsidering its intelligence-sharing protocols with Israel. The Foreign Office denied any major disruption, but behind closed doors, relationships were fraying. One MI6 veteran summarized it best. "Mossad had crossed a line. We were allies, yes. But there's a difference between cooperation and manipulation." European allies began pressuring London to act. Austria demanded an explanation for why foreign agents had operated on its soil. British diplomats in Vienna scrambled to distance themselves, insisting London had no prior knowledge. The British Prime Minister authorized a quiet but symbolic move: the expulsion of a senior Israeli diplomat, identified unofficially as Mossad's London station representative. It was a public gesture meant to restore trust with Europe, but it marked a deep scar between London and Tel Aviv. While the UK raged, inside Mossad there was no remorse. In Tel Aviv, senior officials argued that European allies didn't understand the urgency of Israel's security threats. Iran's shadow networks were expanding across Europe, from Hamburg to Geneva, and Mossad believed hesitation only strengthened Tehran's hand. They viewed winter harvest as a preventive strike, not a betrayal. The agent who led the Vienna team was quietly commended in an internal memo for initiative and success under adverse conditions. One Israeli analyst later admitted in a closed interview, "London plays politics. We play survival." This mindset, pragmatic, unflinching, and at times ruthless, had defined Mossad's identity since its birth. But it came at a cost, alienating even those who once stood beside them. By late 2010, MI6 had begun systematically reducing Mossad's access to shared European intelligence platforms. Information flow between the two services was filtered, sometimes delayed by days. British analysts began coordinating directly with the CIA instead, bypassing Israeli channels entirely. In intelligence terms, that was an unmistakable signal. You're no longer trusted. But Mossad didn't back down. Throughout 2011 and 2012, they continued running independent operations across Europe, targeting Iranian businessmen, Hezbollah financiers, and logistics couriers. Each time, European governments grew more furious, while MI6 quietly documented the incidents, building a dossier of violations. The tension was reaching its peak, and by 2013, a new layer was added: cyber espionage. Mossad's Unit 8200 had begun intercepting European diplomatic communications, allegedly including data from British embassies. To MI6, it was proof that the so-called ally had become an uncontrolled variable. In 2014, a high-ranking British intelligence officer, name withheld from all records, traveled to Tel Aviv under diplomatic cover. The purpose? To renegotiate the boundaries of intelligence sharing and confront Mossad about repeated unsanctioned missions. The meeting was civil but cold. The Israeli representatives listened, nodded, and gave polite reassurances. But behind those formal smiles, nothing changed. Within months, another covert assassination took place in Eastern Europe. Again, whispers tied it back to Mossad. Again, fake European passports were found. This time, MI6 didn't even bother filing a complaint. The silence said everything. The alliance, though still publicly intact, had effectively broken apart in practice. In the intelligence world, reputation is currency. And for both MI6 and Mossad, winter harvest had cost more than anyone expected. The UK lost credibility with its European partners, who questioned how deeply Israel had infiltrated British intelligence circles. Israel lost the trust of one of its longest-standing Western allies, but neither side could afford a public fallout, so both pretended nothing happened. Reports were buried, files were sealed, agents were reassigned. What remained unspoken, however, was clear to everyone inside both agencies. The alliance that began in the spirit of cooperation had turned into a rivalry built on distrust and damage control. The Cold War between allies had begun, and the next we would show just how far the deception would go. The aftermath of winter harvest didn't erupt overnight. It simmered, quietly, diplomatically, beneath the polished handshakes and polite smiles of the intelligence community. London and Tel Aviv both pretended the storm had passed, but in truth, they were already digging trenches on opposite sides of a shadow battlefield. When the Vienna incident became impossible to hide, whispers spread through the European intelligence circuit. Mossad had gone rogue again, but this time, they'd stepped on British ground rules. Inside the corridors of Vauxhall Cross, MI6's directors began asking dangerous questions. How long have we been giving them access to our field networks? How many operations have they run behind our backs? The more analysts looked, the more alarming the picture became. In files marked joint, MI6 discovered discrepancies, intercepted transmissions from Eastern Europe that Mossad had classified differently in its reports. Some were doctored, Others were simply missing. It wasn't incompetence. It was deliberate. Mossad had filtered the intelligence it shared, giving London what it needed to know, never what it wanted to know. By early 2015, the informal partnership between MI6 and Mossad had mutated into something else, an invisible Cold War. Both agencies were still allies on paper, but every exchange was now laced with distrust. The British suspected that Mossad was using the shared intel channels not only for counterterrorism, but to map Europe's own spy infrastructure. The tension turned digital first. Inside GCHQ's cybersecurity division, analysts began detecting unusual data patterns, encrypted pings moving through Israeli proxy servers, bouncing through Cyprus and back into Europe. These were not ordinary cyber probes. They were information siphons, extracting small packets from shared databases. A senior British officer described it in a closed briefing. "They're not stealing from us. They're watching us." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The two agencies that had once hunted Soviet moles side by side were now treating each other like infiltrators. It was in the summer of 2016 when the covert rivalry nearly exploded into public view. In Larnaca, Cyprus, a known hub for both Western and Israeli intelligence, local police arrested a dual national suspected of espionage. He was carrying encrypted drives, burner phones, and a diplomatic access card issued by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The man refused to talk, citing consular protection. What caught MI6's attention wasn't his arrest, it was the location. The safe house he was using was one that British intelligence had quietly rented under NATO cover 2 years earlier. For London, this was no coincidence. Mossad had deliberately infiltrated a British listening post. Within days, British officials demanded explanations from Tel Aviv. Israel's response was classic deniability. Independent contractor, not under our direction. But the digital forensics told a different story. The equipment recovered from the Cyprus flat contained surveillance logs from European embassies, including the UK's own outpost in Nicosia. This was a red line. Behind closed doors, a senior MI6 officer reportedly told his Israeli counterpart, "You've crossed into friendly territory. That's not how allies behave." To which the Israeli simply replied, "That depends on what kind of ally you think we are." That remark summed up the new reality. At the geopolitical level, the world was changing fast. Brexit had fractured Europe's intelligence framework, forcing MI6 to rethink its alliances. The CIA had started pulling more of Britain's resources into American-led missions, leaving less room for independent cooperation with Israel. Mossad, meanwhile, was focused on Iran's growing influence in Syria and Lebanon, a fight it believed most Western agencies didn't take seriously enough. To Tel Aviv, European intelligence was becoming risk-averse, bureaucratic, and slow. To London, Mossad was becoming reckless, operating with impunity, manipulating diplomacy for tactical gain. In 2017, when a Hezbollah-linked financier was mysteriously found dead in Berlin, British analysts noticed familiar signatures in the method of the hit. Forged Balkan passports, untraceable cash payments, digital wipes on hotel servers. It wasn't German intelligence, it was Mossad, again operating without notice in a European capital. The Berlin case reignited everything MI6 had tried to contain. In a classified memo circulated internally, one section read, "Israel's unilateral actions continue to undermine joint counterintelligence integrity. Future cooperation should be reassessed." That phrase, reassessed, in intelligence language meant cut off until further notice. The real fallout, however, wasn't between London and Tel Aviv. It was inside Europe itself. France, Germany, and Italy had grown wary of Israeli intelligence operations that seemed to ignore continental sovereignty. Now, With the UK caught in the middle, Brussels began questioning London's reliability as a security partner. A senior EU diplomat put it bluntly, "If the British can't control what the Israelis are doing on their soil, why should we trust them with our intelligence?" That pressure forced MI6 into a defensive posture. To save face, London began sharing less with Mossad, especially regarding European operations. For the first time in decades, Israel's reach across the continent began to shrink. But Mossad, rather than backing down, pivoted. They built new channels through private contractors, cyber fronts, and business networks tied to the arms trade. They didn't need MI6's permission anymore. By 2018, it was no longer MI6 versus Mossad. It was MI6 trying to contain Mossad. Then came the operation that finally exposed how deep the mistrust had gone. In early 2019, MI6 uncovered traces of a covert Israeli asset embedded inside a British data analytics firm, a company that handled sensitive defense contracts and communications encryption for the UK government. The asset wasn't spying for a rival power. He was relaying information back to Tel Aviv about British cyber initiatives in the Middle East. When confronted, the individual disappeared before arrest, reportedly exfiltrated via diplomatic transport. The event never reached public news, but internally it caused shockwaves. For MI6, it was the final confirmation that Mossad had crossed from ally to adversary in key domains. In response, British cyber defense units purged Israeli-linked contractors from defense projects and restricted future joint operations. The intelligence divorce was now formal, quiet, unannounced, but absolute. Yet even in this climate of suspicion, pragmatism survived. Both sides knew that total separation was impossible. When Iranian networks were active in Europe, MI6 still relied on Mossad's human assets. When Israeli agents faced exposure, MI6 sometimes provided diplomatic shields to avoid scandals. It was a strange, transactional partnership, cooperation born from necessity, not trust. A British intelligence veteran summed it up privately. "We still share intel when our interests align, but we never assume honesty anymore." With Mossad, everything comes with a shadow. And perhaps that was the lesson both sides had to learn. In espionage, there are no eternal friendships, only intersecting agendas. When reporters occasionally asked officials in London about tensions with Israel's intelligence services, the answers were rehearsed. The United Kingdom and Israel enjoy a strong and enduring security partnership. But behind those diplomatic smiles lay years of damage, suspicion, and silence. Every now and then, a British officer assigned to Tel Aviv would mention the odd atmosphere, friendly meetings that never felt honest, polite cooperation that hid invisible boundaries. The phrase that circulated within MI6 training circles captured it perfectly. With Mossad, share your coffee, not your secrets. By the dawn of the 2020s, the alliance that once operated in perfect sync had transformed into a chess match. Each move was calculated. Each favor had a price. And beneath it all, both sides watched each other. Allies by label, adversaries by instinct. The Vienna operation that started it all was officially erased from archives, labeled as a joint success. But every operative who lived through it knew the truth. It was a betrayal disguised as cooperation. The fallout had changed the landscape of Western intelligence. Mossad had proven it would do whatever it deemed necessary to protect Israel's security, no matter who it alienated. MI6 had learned that alliances could be fragile, even with friends. In the end, both emerged more cautious, more paranoid, and more alone. And somewhere, deep in the encrypted servers of both agencies, Winter Harvest still sits, classified under different names, written from opposite perspectives, each side believing they were right, When the dust from the secret feud finally began to settle, both MI6 and Mossad found themselves in an uncomfortable truth. They could not live without each other. The winter harvest operation had fractured their confidence, but in the shadow world of espionage, isolation was a luxury no one could afford. By 2020, new global threats had begun reshaping the landscape. Cyber warfare, disinformation, and Iran's growing web of influence stretching from Damascus to the Mediterranean. These challenges forced old rivals back into the same room, even if no one dared to call it reconciliation. Officially, there was no crisis. British and Israeli diplomats gave polished statements about deep cooperation and shared democratic values. But within the halls of Vauxhall Cross and Glylote Junction, the conversations were far less polite. Senior analysts in London called for operational quarantine, restricting Mossad's access to European networks until Israel restored transparency. Tel Aviv quietly pushed back, warning that without Israeli intel feeds, British operatives in the Middle East would be flying blind. And so, the uneasy dance continued. They spoke through intermediaries, never directly. Encrypted lines buzzed between case officers who no longer trusted the voice on the other end. It was the intelligence version of a divorce where neither partner could afford to move out. In 2021, the first tentative bridge appeared, an exchange of encrypted satellite data over Syria. MI6 analysts noticed Iranian convoys shifting weapons components toward the Golan frontier, and Mossad confirmed the movement independently. For one night, cooperation was reborn. Both sides shared live coordinates, and within hours, an Israeli airstrike destroyed the convoy before it reached Lebanese soil. The operation wasn't publicly acknowledged, but within both agencies, it marked the quiet end of the freeze. No press releases, no signatures, just a shared understanding. They needed each other when the stakes were high. Still, the wounds hadn't healed. For every file MI6 shared, Mossad shared two, with redactions. For every request Israel made, London waded through layers of caution. The balance had shifted permanently. The days of blind trust were gone. In the months that followed, London attempted an internal audit of all joint projects conducted with Israel between 2005 and 2019. The findings, though never made public, confirmed years of manipulation, misreported field data, unacknowledged agents, and covert funding channels linked to front companies in Europe. When briefed on the results, one retired British handler put it bluntly, "They played us, and we let them, because we thought we were equals." Yet even as the files closed one chapter, another opened. In 2022, MI6 intercepted chatter suggesting Iranian intelligence was hunting Mossad operatives across Eastern Europe, a campaign of revenge killings and kidnappings linked to past Israeli operations. Suddenly, London faced a dilemma: let Mossad deal with its own enemies, or quietly help stop the bloodshed on European soil. The decision was made in a single sentence during an emergency briefing. If this fight spills into our cities, it becomes our fight too. And just like that, the cycle of cooperation resumed. Born again from necessity, not forgiveness. By 2023, Mossad's activities across Europe had become quieter, smarter, less visible. They no longer relied on overt hits or clumsy surveillance. Instead, they worked through cyber fronts and proxy contractors, shell tech companies that provided security services to banks, telecoms, and airports. MI6 knew it, and instead of confronting them, they adapted. They started tracking Israeli cyber operations not to stop them, but to understand them, to learn their methods, their coding signatures, their invisible fingerprints. The rivalry had evolved into something strange: espionage by observation. Each side studying the other, mirroring tactics, sharpening their edge. One MI6 officer described it later. They became our greatest teachers, not by choice, but by example. Even inside Mossad, the tone had shifted. Younger operatives, shaped by the chaos of digital warfare, began to view MI6 less as an adversary and more as a benchmark, an older intelligence service struggling to stay relevant in a world ruled by algorithms and drones. By late 2024, both agencies were drawn into a far bigger confrontation. A shadowy cyber collective, suspected to be Russian-backed, had begun infiltrating Western intelligence networks, targeting Israel's digital infrastructure and Britain's defense systems simultaneously. This new common enemy forced the two rivals back into tight coordination. Joint cyber task forces quietly met in neutral cities, Geneva, Vienna, and The Hague, under the guise of European security conferences. Behind those doors, Mossad and MI6 officers shared data in real time again, rebuilding fragments of the partnership that Winter Harvest had destroyed years earlier. But something had changed. This was no longer friendship. It was strategic alignment, driven by survival. Both sides had realized that, in the modern world of espionage, trust is optional. Information is currency, and survival trumps loyalty every time. Behind the scenes, the men and women who had once risked their lives together now carried scars invisible to the public. Some had been reassigned. Others had retired, disillusioned. One British officer, reflecting years later, said in an off-record interview, "When you partner with Mossad, you have to remember, your mission ends when theirs does, not before." A former Israeli handler countered with a quieter truth. "We never betrayed anyone. We just never promised trust to begin with." Perhaps that was the essence of the entire saga. Two nations, bound by necessity, separated by philosophy. One defined by protocol, the other by instinct. Both convinced they were right. In hindsight, Winter Harvest became a secret textbook within both agencies, a cautionary tale taught to new recruits. The British version warned of overdependence on foreign intelligence. The Israeli version emphasized the price of hesitation when security is at stake. Different conclusions, same event. By the mid-2020s, whispers of renewed joint missions began to surface again. Covert actions in North Africa, counter-smuggling ops in the Balkans, and satellite coordination over the Red Sea. But even then, each meeting started with the same unspoken question. Can we trust them this time? No one ever answered. The truth is, MI6 and Mossad never truly made peace. They simply learned to coexist in the gray zone, between cooperation and competition, between friendship and suspicion. Their rivalry became the quiet backbone of modern espionage, a secret theater where both sides still test, observe, and occasionally rescue one another, depending on who benefits more that day. And for every operation that succeeds in the dark, there's another erased from memory, redacted, deleted, lost to official history. But the operatives who lived it remember. They remember Vienna. They remember Cyprus. And they remember that in the world of spies, the line between ally and enemy is thinner than a cipher key. In the end, the secret war between MI6 and Mossad didn't tend with a treaty. It faded into the silence where most intelligence stories do. But its lessons still echo through every modern operation carried out today. How power, secrecy, and trust collide in the shadows. If you've followed this far, you now know a version of history that was never meant for headlines. Tell me below, what do you think? Are alliances in espionage built on trust or just shared convenience? Like, share, and subscribe to Spy Wars, Declassified. where we reveal the stories intelligence agencies wish you'd forget. One secret at a time.